Someone else told me, before Margaret said anything, someone else told me about it. I was going to get my dad. I got a copy of the deed. I had the same exact thing.
They can go through this. Of course, it was a gift from Thorne. He paid my grandfather when I was young.
Guys, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. It's incredibly heartening to see so many people here, even if probably half of the audience is here as a result of the coercion or bribery. These are mostly my students. I'm Robert McHugh, president of the Historical Society. Ashley Lempka, who's a board member of the Historical Society. Our plan for the next probably 4.5 hours, at least it'll feel like that, is to talk a little bit about the Lyall report. Try to put it in context. Just to give you a very brief introduction to what this is. This is arguably the most important artifact, document that we have in the Millbrook Historical Society archives. It is a 241-page sociological study of Millbrook completed in 1913. It has an incredible amount of information on pretty much any topic you can think of. There's statistics about what jobs people were doing at that time, the racial, ethnic composition of the community, where people got their water from and how safe it was to drink. Appropriately for where we are now, what books people checked out of the library, how many people went to church and which churches they went to. As you can imagine, a document that's 241 pages, there's a lot in there. So we're only going to kind of touch on the surface. Now, I kind of hinted at a second ago, our primary agenda is to try to put this in a broader historical context. What was happening in the country in 1913, make it easier for you to understand what was happening in Millbrook and what's included in this report. And so that will be my primary function. I'm talking about the context. We've got lots of slides, we've got lots of images from the report for you to look at. And Ashley's going to talk more specifically about the content of the report, how these kind of broad developments, how this context kind of applies at the local level. I'll just say one quick thing before we really get to it. I think it's standard at talks like this to tell people to hold questions until the end. That always feels weird to me as a teacher, you know, want people to ask questions all the time. So as we're going through this, if you guys have questions, don't wait to the end. Raise your hand, we'll stop right there. Don't worry about interrupting, all right? Better to deal with questions as they come up than kind of backload everything. All right, and hopefully you guys will have plenty of questions. Any questions so far? All right. So 1913, when this report is produced, is the absolute height of the progressive era in the United States. Generally, the progressive era is considered to be the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Roughly from the time when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901, maybe to the 19th Amendment when women get the right to vote in 1920. The progressive era, to a large degree, is a reaction against the period that came before it, the Gilded Age, which was a time of unregulated, unrestricted industrial capitalism. And so, at the core of the progressive era is this fundamental belief that government needs to be more active. Federal government, state government, municipal government, that government needs to do more in order to curtail some of the abuses and excesses of laissez-faire capitalism. And so the report to some degree reflects that attitude. This is the cover page of the report. The copy that we actually possess in the archives belonged to one of the key figures behind it, Reverend Lyall, after whom the church down the road is named. Right in the report, it says, doing this report is a progressive move, a step in advance. But we are living in a progressive age. In this survey idea, Millbrook leads and not merely follows. The part above is a quote from Woodrow Wilson's inaugural address that he had delivered just weeks before this report was made public. And so one part of the progressive movement is government needs to do more, government needs to be more active. But there are other aspects to the progressive movement that really connect directly to what we're going to look at today. At the core of the progressive movement is a kind of fanatical obsession with data, with statistics, with quantification, with expertise. And that comes through over and over and over again in this report. When the idea for this report first came to the fore, the committee that was largely responsible for producing this created a very detailed questionnaire that was given to everybody who lived in the village of Millbrook, the town of Washington. These are some images from the questionnaire. The stuff they ask is very specific. It's not only like, how much education did you get, and what's your job, and what church did you go to? It's what newspapers do you subscribe to and read? What magazines do you have in your home? Where do you get your water? What happens with sewage from your house? Where does it get disposed of? Dozens and dozens of things that are asked of everyone in the community. And not everyone responds, but the response rate is pretty good. This kind of study, in this systematic way, this kind of obsession with collection of information, so characteristic of this progressive period. Now, I said that people went out and got answers to these survey questions. This is one of my favorite parts from the Lyall report. 18 men and 2 women were engaged in the survey in the open country, meaning the town as opposed to the village, besides several wives of the men who assisted, in some cases doing most of the work. That is very relatable. So this thing is 241 pages. In those 241 pages, there are 54 separate tables of data. There are 44 graphs and charts. I'll show you a couple examples just to give you a sample of what these graphs and charts look like. We have line graphs tracking population change in Millbrook the 20 years or so leading up to 1913. You can see the population of the village is increasing dramatically, right, from 1890 to 1910. That's when Millbrook actually becomes a village, so that makes sense. We've got bar graphs. Question?
Did this have to be funded in any way, or was it totally volunteer with no funds at all associated with it?
I'm not sure how much fundraising they did. It doesn't really talk too much about that in the report itself. I mean, I think it's a volunteer effort. It is largely kind of the purview of the Protestant churches in town. The YMCA is involved in it as well. And we'll get into some of that stuff a little bit more later. So this shows you, based on different professions that people had, were they more likely to own their own home or rent a home? Right? So if you're a farmer, more likely to own your own home. If you're a laborer, more likely to rent your home. This is the kind of information that's included. This is just meant to be a little sample. Their obsession with graphs and charts goes so far as they create a chart that shows 50% of the people in the community were members of churches and 50% were not. This doesn't really add to your understanding of this statistic, right? You don't need a chart to be able to process 50-50, but this is what they're interested in. There's also photography. This is one of the great things about the Lyall report. There are 22 photographs that are pasted right in, scrapbook style. Many of them have captions, and we'll look at many of these photographs as we go through. The image on the right is from the Lyall report. One of the kind of interesting things to do when you look at these photographs, and Ashley and I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out, is to try to figure out like where this is in the village. It's hard to tell for a lot of this stuff. I mean, maybe you folks would have better luck recognizing it if you lived here longer. But that's a pretty dramatic photo on the right, unpleasant looking. Anybody know what's on the left? That is not Millbrook. That's a photo from Jacob Reese's How the Other Half Lives. Some of you guys are probably familiar with. Kind of the first real dramatic use of photography to try to inspire social change. But there's some similarities there, right? The one on the left is New York City, right? So an urban environment. But again, the use of these images to try to shock the public into action, to doing something about this. All right, this is going to be the most painful part of the presentation, I am sure. But I want to read this all to you to give you a taste of this obsession with statistics and with data. All right? So hopefully you'll be still alert at the end of this. The value of church property in the community is more than $75,000. 2 churches alone have an equipment of $54,100. These have buildings used for social purposes valued at about $14,100. The 2 churches are valued at about $40,000. The 2 church buildings are open a total of 7 hours on Sunday. During Lent, they are open a total of 15 hours on Wednesdays and Fridays. This makes a total of 389 hours of use for the entire year for both church buildings, except on special occasions, which only occur a few times. This is an average of 1.06 hours per day for both churches, or 0.53, or about half an hour per day for each church. The other buildings connected with the 2 churches are used 2¼ hours each Sunday, 27 hours each week aside from Sunday. 27 hours per week is equal to 4½ hours per day, or 2¼ hours per day for each building aside from Sunday. This makes about 1,910 hours of actual use during the entire year for all of the $54,000 of property. But only 20.3% of this use can be credited to $40,000 worth of property. That is, 26% of the property is doing 79.7% of the work. The 2 school buildings are in use about 4,000 hours per year, or more than twice the time of the above churches. You get a sense of the obsession with data and statistics, right? Characteristic of the progressive era. The tone of the Lyall report is also very typical of the progressive period. Bless you. There's a lot of moralism. There's a lot of judgment in it. It sometimes reads as very paternalistic. And so I just want to give you a couple examples of this. Because you have, on the one hand, these very dry statistics, but also kind of the judgment that goes with the interpretation of those statistics. The management of very few farms in the community is on an efficient basis. The large estates are managed to quite an extent by well-trained men, but most of the other farms are not worked by men who know their business. Right? Very judgy. On the other hand, there may be found many wretched hovels, some of which are unfit even for the shelter of beasts. And this is perhaps my favorite part. There are 2 pool rooms. They are open on Sunday. You're supposed to gasp when I say that. And there is not the slightest doubt but that gambling is carried on. That makes me think of that line from Casablanca when they say, like, gambling, gambling. What? The room on Church Street has an evening patronage of 50, nearly all American young men. The best that can be said of the rooms is that they are dens of vice, where foul language is customary, and fistic encounters not infrequent. Fistic encounters is a great phrase. We sometimes have fistic encounters at the high school.
They do say at one point, though, that there is one pool room owned by the Italians, and that was the highest morale of all of them. They kept their pool room very moral. Just to throw that in there.
Yeah, and maybe we should just point out at this point, because it comes up kind of in this quote, 50 people, nearly all American young men. In that context, American young men means not Italian, right? That means white, native born, right? That's the language that they use in this.
Well, you'll see throughout the report, a lot of this focuses on the Italians and the influx into Millbrook and kind of them fearing the takeover of the Italians, so to speak.
So just a couple examples of photography that's included. And it's really interesting to read the captions that go with the photographs. It's almost as if someone different wrote the captions, because the captions tend to be the most kind of moralistic and judgy, right, of anything. Open well, unsanitary surroundings, and lack of community pride are manifest. Such homes often become a physical and moral menace to the community. Moral and physical degenerates often find shelter in such surroundings. Here, vice breeds unmolested. This is the most curious part, the whole Lyall report. This is totally out of context, right? Because it's just a photograph that's pasted in. It shows a black family, husband, wife, 2 young children, and the caption is, "Sometimes the thrifty looking are shiftless." I certainly think that is reflective of progressive era attitudes about race. But you almost want to think like, whoever came up with this like had some personal grievance almost against these people. It's so odd, like it's out of context for the rest of the report. So that is the broad context, how this kind of fits in with the progressive era in general. Now there's a more specific context. The very first line, practically, of this report, page 2 of 241, says, "The Millbrook survey was an outgrowth of the Men and Religion Forward movement." I had never heard of this when I read this for the first time. And so this was one of the more interesting aspects of doing the research for this talk, learning what this was. And it was both interesting and a little bit disturbing to kind of learn more about the Men and Religion Forward movement. It was a very short-lived, but very popular movement, 1911, 1912, right when the idea for this is emerging in Millbrook. And essentially, the idea of the Men and Religion Forward movement is that Protestant Christianity has become overly feminized. And that has driven men away from Protestant churches. That religion was too about emotion. And women could relate to that and feel a sense of belonging. But men, who were more hard-headed and pragmatic, according to the ideas of the progressive era, didn't feel a sense of home. They cited a statistic as part of the Men and Religion Forward movement that there were 3 million missing men in American churches. Now, this sounds in some ways kind of ridiculous, our perspective today, but this was a very mainstream movement. 1911, 1912, about 1 million people across the country participated in some event associated with this movement. There are articles from Poughkeepsie newspapers, events taking place in Poughkeepsie. 700, 800 people attending events, all men attending events, part of this effort. It's supported by John D. Rockefeller, by J.P. Morgan, by William Jennings Bryan, some of the most prominent business and political leaders in the country. And I just want to read to you a quote from the leader of this movement to give you a sense of the kind of misogyny that is at the heart of it. This is a guy named Fred Smith, very generic name. In greatest numbers, the conspicuous poets, musicians, artists, politicians, merchants, generals have been men. This seems to have been the wisdom of God, for about every departure from this rule has caused unhappy friction. I could write a volume upon the tragedies with which I am familiar concerning the homes of women who have felt it necessary to assume masculine functions. Whatever may be true in exceptional cases, the general fact remains that in a very real sense, this is a man's world. This is the Men in Religion Forward movement. By the way, said this is really mainstream. They bought billboards in Times Square to advertise this. They bought advertisements on the sports pages of newspapers across the country. They thought that's where they would reach men. At exactly the moment when people are coming together in Millbrook to plan the Lyall report, this movement culminates in New York City in a big rally held at Carnegie Hall. In April of 1912, exact time. By the way, what else happens in April of 1912? The Titanic sinks, right? At the same time all this other stuff is happening. This is a photograph of Carnegie Hall. You see the slogan there, this giant banner in the background. More men for religion, more religion for men. That's the idea.
It said also, sorry, on the slide before, bring your boy. It doesn't bring your boys only at the bottom.
Yep.
Bring your boy along.
Now, a lot of what's in the Lyall report doesn't seem to have much directly to do with this concern about religion becoming overly feminized. But there are statistics in there about how many men belong to this church, how many women belong to this church, is there a gap? Basically, they come to the conclusion that it's not really a problem in Millbrook, right? We got enough men attending church, not an issue. And so it's kind of like a throwaway part of the report. But one of the things that comes out of the Men in Religion Forward movement is that a number of communities across the country undertake something similar to what Millbrook does. And I just want to read you. This is South Bend, Indiana. So this is a much larger community than Millbrook, right? A city opposed to a village. But South Bend, Indiana does a study described like this. They want to learn about, quote, the number of saloons, dance halls, theaters, burlesque shows and their character, arrests and convictions of men, women, and children for what causes and under what conditions, detailed definite statements as to water supply, sewerage, taxation, condition of bakeries and meat markets, the sanitary conditions of tenements, factories, restaurants, and hotels, an exhaustive inquiry concerning public schools, playgrounds, libraries. Alas, like Millbrook in 1912, 1913 had no burlesque houses, but the rest of that could be a summary of what's in the Lyall report. I mean, it's pretty similar. And so Millbrook is not alone in undertaking this campaign to try to study their community, understand the community better. Any questions about the context, the broader context about the Progressive Era, the more specific context about Men in Religion Forward movement, before I turn it over to Ashley?
This must have been brought on by what the suffragette movement was beginning to bring, and women were taking more responsibility and pushing for more environment.
Yeah, you don't really see that in the report. I
That's
mean, there aren't references to the suffrage movement. There are definite references, and this is kind of what Ashley's going to talk about next, to alcohol. And remember, this is just a few years before the Prohibition Amendment, which comes immediately before the suffrage amendment. And so that's a key component of this, and I'll show you some examples of it in a second.
Wasn't Mrs. Lyall very active in this, making up this report?
Yeah, there are references to
Her, she was a.
To her
big push
helping.
behind it.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so women are definitely, like that quote that I put up before of like, hey, women did a lot of the work here. Absolutely, they're involved, which I don't know if that proves the point of the Men in Religion Forward movement or works against it, but somehow it's connected.
So now we get into the actual Lyall report, and it starts off talking about crime. Also, I just want to know, I have a lot of good facts and quotes. I just don't know if I'm going to remember to read them all to you guys, but there's some very funny quotes throughout this whole report, and you'll see why. So one of the interesting, you'll see the first offense that you wouldn't even think of today is bastardy. There's disorderly conduct, seduction, a lot of crimes that we wouldn't even think about now. You'll see throughout this report, though, they are trying to connect liquor with arrests and crime. They said that in 1913, the arrests in Millbrook increased in a large number, and they didn't know if it was because of the due diligence of the police or if people were drinking more. And you'll also see how this relates to the water issue that we had in Millbrook as I go on.
So just to point out one thing about this. So this is basically, it's hard to interpret this, I don't know. Basically saying that, hey, people who are arrested between the ages of 11 and 15, which are a substantial number of people arrested between the ages of 11 and 15, liquor was not the cause of their criminality. But for like every group above, what, age 19, yeah, liquor was at fault because they were drunk and just got arrested for public drunkenness, and that's why they were, right?
Which they said in the report that the largest number of intoxicated arrests was a man completing their technical education. So that's about that age. Yeah. It's also, there's a quote that I wanted to read. It said, "It should be noted that the Italians have, on the whole, been as law-abiding as the rest of the population," which is great. Negroes have offended frequently, almost as much as the Italians, although the Italians are 3 times as numerous. So that was kind of a compliment to the Italians, who they weren't particularly fond of at this time.
But it's interesting to read because there's a lot of references like that, which are, yeah, the Italians aren't committing more crimes, but if you read a little bit between the lines, it seems like the Lyall report has as a goal pushing back against these ideas that exist within the community, right? So for the report to say, yeah, the Italians aren't committing any more crimes, you don't really need to say that unless that's what people think, and that's what kind of the popular conception is in the community, and there's lots of references like that, and you'll see later more examples like that.
And also, there were 3 arrests made of men visiting Bennett College, and they didn't want to be held responsible for those statistics. So here's an example. This is the chart that shows the nationality and arrest. So you can see the Americans, which are white. The Italians are separate. And then the colored people. You're a teacher. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just say, like, you know, it's a little dicey to use some of this terminology, but like the terminology that they use consistently throughout this report is white/American, those terms are essentially interchangeable, Italian, which is its own thing, and then colored or Negro, right? So that's the terminology.
Yeah, just to be clear. Again, they were relating a lot of the crimes to liquor, so they appointed a person to go out to check out all the saloons and the hotel bars to figure out facts of drinking and, you know, how many people work there and what the income of the bar is. And they sent this person out to do the study, and he disappeared. And Robert and I were joking that he probably just stayed at the bars drinking. It's like, okay. So they're missing some of these statistics. statistics.
There's so much between the lines there.
You'll see I underlined he failed to, as the special investigator, failed to do his task. Or maybe he was in the red. So I'm gonna go in a little bit more about the water supply in Millbrook, but this just to start it off. The water in Millbrook was so bad, I mean, it was pretty much, you couldn't drink it or wash with it, that you'll see in this quote that the men were drinking beer because they couldn't stand the water, and when they asked what the women were drinking, they said boiled milk. I mean, milk or boiled water. So they're relating the drinking of the beer, because they can't drink the water, to the liquor consumption, to the crime. Okay, so now I'm gonna go into water supply, which you have to brace yourselves for. It's pretty horrible. You can see in this photo, the outhouse up on the hill. So remember, back then, nobody had indoor bathrooms. Everybody had outhouses. They were never cleaned. I mean, I think it was like $30 a cleaning, which back then was a lot of money because, of course, who wanted to do that? And the bottoms of them were very open, so if it rained, everything was coming through, draining into the little creeks in the back, into the soil, which would then go into their wells. So during this report, they went around asking people, you know, what they thought about the water. A lot of people said they couldn't even wash with it because the smell was so disgusting. It tested positive for E. coli, a couple of the wells. And one well that had E. coli, the local pharmacy was using to make their soft drinks. So people were constantly consuming this water. I mean, they were probably just so used to it that they didn't know. But there was one quote that said, the village health officer said, "We are drinking each other's sewage," which is basically what it got down to. Ironically, the Italians were really pushing for some kind of water supply system. And they did, as part of the surveys, they went around to the village asking residents, would you be willing to pay for this? I think it was $15 a month to have clean water, and 3/4 of them said no. So,
Do we know where this is, the scene?
I don't know, does anybody know? The only clue I can think is the house in the back, because those outhouses obviously are not there anymore. Does anybody know? Millbrook?
There's no indications in the report of addresses, locations,
Well,
really.
The worst areas around that time were up in the Hogan Alley,
Alden?
Alden Place.
And there's
That's
some
where
images,
most of your
there are
Italians
images of
lived
that.
then.
Yeah.
And that's why they complained that, you know, the sewage system was going into the water and Ashley
Yeah, into
explained.
the water, into the wells,
Yeah.
it was just
So
all
most of those,
streaming through.
photos that look kind of bad from off from Alden Place.
You know, I said this before, I think, just in passing, but some of these photos like this one, they are captioned things like, I'm adding a little to this for dramatic effect, but despite what you might think, this is not the Italian neighborhood, right? So the implication being, like, if you saw something like this, you would assume that. But at least 2 of the photos that look like this have a caption that basically says, this is not the backyard of a foreign family. So that's in there.
So this photo illustrates, you can kind of understand when the outhouses are draining, whether it's they're overflowing or it's raining, they're going right into the stream, right into the wells, which is pretty hard to imagine now, considering we complain if the water goes off for a half hour. Oh, garbage. I will go into garbage collection. Oh, this is just little statistics about the bacteria. As you can see, pretty gross.
Yeah, so this is very characteristic with the progressive era. Let's actually test the water, right? Let's bring in an expert, see if this is safe to drink, test it for various bacteria, and
What kind of
yeah,
pump they have.
it's present.
Well, there's another photo showing the outhouse connected to the stream. This is just a little quote about the privies, which are outhouses. Again, they're not cleaned a lot of the time. There was one story where one guy just kept moving his outhouse 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, and he'd be moving it closer and closer to his neighbor's house, so they're getting all his waste. This just says that Millbrook was hovering on the verge of calamity, and the doctors even reported that the water conditions were unspeakably bad. And I already said this, they were used to basically drinking each other's sewage. This is another photo of a little boy standing right next to the spring where they get all their water from, and you can see it's surrounded by garbage and God only knows what else. I'll read this. Outhouses may make the best clothesline post, but ashes, kitchen refuse, and tin cans may add to the attraction of yard, but outhouses conveniently placed near a stream may be nice for the outhouse owners, but how about the fellow further down the stream?
So that's like I was telling you about before, sometimes the tone of the captions, like this one is very sarcastic, right? It's odd, it's like out of character with the rest of the report, which is more statistics and there's some judgment in there, but this is a weird tone.
And another reason why they wanted a proper water system for Millbrook was in case of a fire. I mean, they said, you know, somebody could wake up and their house could be on fire, a store could be on fire, and then, of course, 3 years later, Millbrook had that huge fire on the corner of Franklin and Church Street, which just proved their point. Okay, now we're gonna go into garbage disposal. So it's pretty hard to imagine that there was no proper garbage disposal back then. If you had kitchen waste, scraps, you know, bones, anything left over from the kitchen that would normally get buried into your backyard, which again is seeping into your well and your water system. Sometimes they would separate their tin cans from their garbage, which is early recycling, and a man would come by and he would pay them for the tin cans, but he was very particular about which families he did that for. He didn't do it for all of them. But this is right in the village. I mean, this is in how garbage was disposed of back then. Another photo. Kitchen waste, tin cans. Oh, this is where it says, this is not the work of a foreign family, but of a prominent American family. Just to note that. Another garbage pile. This is your photo.
Sure. Yeah. So in a minute, Ashley's going to talk more about Italian community. But I just wanted to give a little bit of context. You know, for the progressive era, there were absolute winners in the progressive era, right? Consumers are much better off, workers are better off, women get the right to vote. But in the progressive era, they have a real blind spot when it comes to race. And so that, kind of how we would understand race, kind of white-black, but it goes beyond that. One of the more prominent books from this time, it's a bestseller, it's called The Races of Europe. The clear implication of the title being that even among what we would consider the white people of Europe, there are different races. And the typical divide was between Northern Europeans and Southern Europeans. Northern Europeans were sometimes called Teutonic, sometimes called Nordic. Southern Europeans were Mediterranean. This kind of explains why throughout the Lyall report you have white Americans as one category, Italians as another category, because as strange as it seems to our modern ears, many people in the progressive era considered them separate and distinct races. And so this is the moment, kind of 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, when for the first time large waves of Italian immigrants are coming to America, including places like Millbrook. This is our cartoon from 1890. That's fairly typical of kind of the attitude about immigration from Southern Europe. Here's an Italian who is dressed in rags, right? Who is stealing the food of this native-born American as his wife and child kind of cower in the back. I'm trying to figure out if that is a gigantic bowl of butter that he's eating. Other than my father, I've never seen anyone eat that much butter at a meal. I almost want to think like he has enough to share. There's going to be plenty of butter left. And so I just want to read to you a couple quotes from prominent writers of the time to give you a sense of how people viewed Italian immigrants. These are fairly unpleasant, they're disturbing, but these are not kind of minority views in the progressive era. Right? This is how many prominent progressives, people who supported reforms in the workplace, who might have supported giving women the right to vote, felt about immigration, particularly Italian immigration. There's a writer named Edward Ross, who's very popular, his book sold hundreds of thousands of copies, who used these kind of generic stand-in names to refer to a native-born American and an Italian immigrant. He wrote, "William does not leave as many children as Tonio, because he will not huddle his family into one room, eat macaroni off a bare board, work his wife barefoot in the field, and keep his children eating onions instead of at school. That the Mediterranean people are morally below the races of Northern Europe is as certain as any social fact. And there was particular opprobrium heaped on people from southern Italy, right? From Naples, from Sicily. Immigrants from southern Italy, quote, lack the conveniences for thinking. Those from Naples were a degenerate class infected with spiritual hookworm who display a distressing frequency of low foreheads, open mouths, weak chins, poor features, and backless heads." I don't know what the phrase backless heads means. The president of Stanford University, again, prominent person in American society, said there is not 1 in 1,000 from Naples or Sicily that is not a burden on America.
Wow.
And so these are the typical attitudes, right, that exist during the progressive era. This is an age of eugenics. People believe that you can tell someone's character, their intellectual capacity, simply from their race, from the shape of their skull, right? This kind of pseudoscience is all the rage. Right? A few years after the Lyall report comes out, Congress passes the most restrictive anti-immigration law in American history that specifically tries to limit immigration from places like Italy. Right? Basically cuts it off, right, completely. This is the context, right, for this report.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about my favorite part, the Italians in Millbrook. So many of the some of you might know this, many of the Italians, or most from Millbrook, came over as masons to work on the large estates, and they loved the town so much, as you can see why, that they all brought their families over here, which is how they came to Millbrook. They were very proud in the fact that they were the more refined Italians, the better Italians, and like Robert said, being from middle Italy versus Sicily or southern Italy. And they tried to keep the southern Italians away from Millbrook. And they're all most of them are from a town called Fondi, which is near Rome. I don't know, my family's not from there. But
It's exactly halfway between Rome and Naples, on the Appian Way.
Let me say real quick, sorry, actually. There's an explicit reference at one point in the Lyall report that you were kind of hinting at that says, our Italians aren't the bad Italians.
yeah.
Again, I mean, it comes out, it says that. Like, we have a higher class of Italian here in Millbrook.
Well, they promoted Italians to grow, this report does.
So the other Italians said they strived to keep the undesirable fellow countrymen away from Millbrook. They thought of themselves as more socially and intellectually higher than the other ones. So, through this report, they found that the Italian families were having so many children that eventually Millbrook would be overtaken by Italians, and they kind of wanted a solution to this. There was a quote that says, "It's only a question of time, apparently, when the Italians will control the village." Most of the Italians lived on Alden Place, which is where the elementary school is now. They were very condensed in their houses. They said between 14 and 17 children in one house, and there was only maybe 3 to 4 bedrooms in a house. So they were extremely overcrowded. As a result, if the weather was nice out, the street on Alden Place would be jam-packed with kids, just playing in the street nonstop. There was no playground for them, which also through this report they realized was something that needed to happen, mostly based on the Italian children. Here's another chart of the Italian children in the homes, and this is a great picture. It says the typical Italian group, whatever that means. Here's a photo of the end of Alden Place. As you can see, garbage, and this is why they started petitioning that the children have some sort of playground to play on. So it's also interesting through this report that the Italians were basically kept from buying any property in Millbrook. A lot of people that owned property said that they would spoil that section of town if they were to buy a property. It was an unwritten rule, it wasn't in writing, but it was just known that you did not sell to Italians. Here's a house built by an Italian, and this is actually kind of a compliment. It says the industrious, thrifty Italians are accumulating real estate. This house is an honor to the town. Why not let the Italians build more of such homes? So they were kind of coming around to the idea.
That's my grandfather's house.
Oh,
Do you guys recognize where this is?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Washington Avenue.
So Washington, just up from where the pizza place is.
It was in
And
the
so
round table in 1911, the Rod Safari is building a two-family house on Washington Avenue. You got all that information in your archives.
Yeah, and so you see the building on the left there, that you can just see the one window of, that is no longer there. That's where you go into the
Still
parking
there
lot
today.
behind Morano's.
He never lived there. The telephone company moved in on the lower floor, and they made 2 more apartments out of it.
but I mean, it's a beautiful
Well, it was
house,
built
and
in
you can see
1911.
the mason work. Another quote from the Lyall report: "It is only a question of time when the more thrifty will have accumulated sufficient money to buy where they choose." Save it. Another table, population.
So this just shows you that there aren't a lot of elderly Italians, right? That they're younger people coming over, and that if you look at kind of the ratio of like children between, infants and 9 years old, there are more white American children, but it's fairly close compared to like the overall population comparison. Italians are having more children.
And the Italians were noted to be quiet, industrious, and saving. Those were 3 words used in the Lyall report.
No, I'm sensitive to the fact that we're running
Yeah.
short of time, so I'll talk about this
We
very
talked
quickly.
about a lot, like
Yeah,
that.
this to me is the single most controversial and, as a result, most interesting part of this report. I'm just going to read this to you. It says, now let me start here.
Okay.
Influenced to some extent by the Thorne family, who held land near Millbrook, other wealthy New Yorkers have purchased land near the village until today it is almost completely surrounded by their holdings. Much of the incorporated village is also owned by them. Furthermore, at present, all the available land within the village is owned by the realty company, which consists of these same wealthy estate holders. This company has fixed a limit as to whom land shall be sold, excluding all so-called undesirable parties, such as Italians and Americans who are not wanted. Restrictions have been made regarding size of lot, forcing a buyer to purchase a large lot without the privilege of breaking it up later. And buyers have also been compelled to agree to build a house of not less than a certain value. As a result, men of limited means are finding it more and more difficult to build homes. It is also very difficult to rent apartments of any kind. Still a problem in Millbrook. Moreover, the laboring men have been congested to an alarming extent. Especially is this true of the Italians, but it applies also to colored families and many of the American working men. The growth of the town in this way is being choked. It is said quietly that this bottling has been slyly and purposely done by the New York men in order to keep Millbrook always a pretty little country village for their especial enjoyment, just as they have made an artificial pond or a game preserve. Whether this be true or not, the natural expansion of the village is being checked, and an abnormal, unhealthful congestion is taking place, which cannot but cause deterioration in the character of the community. That is boldly put, in a way that much of the Lyall report is not. And that's fairly controversial. I feel like that's even a little controversial today, and this is 109 years after this report
Called
came
the
out.
following of Millbrook, right?
And so this is a map that's in the Lyall report that shows this, right? You guys can probably recognize where a lot of this stuff is, right? The Dietrich Farm, kind of the Hitchcock estate. This is 9 Partners Road. The Wing Estate is where the middle school and the high school are today, right? The Thorn Estate, same place that it is today, the golf club, and then kind of the village there in the middle. So all of these big estates surrounding the village, making it impossible for the village to grow organically out. And the implication in what I just read is that this did not happen accidentally, right? That this was a deliberate plan by the estate owners, right, to limit growth, right? And one of the remarkable things about the village of Millbrook is how unbelievably consistent the village's population has been in the last 100 and 120 years. It has hardly changed at all, the village itself. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, this section right here, when I was reading it, there's a handwritten note on the side. There are occasionally in the Lyall report words that are crossed out, like a single word written in the margin. But this is the only example of this. And here's what it says. This paragraph is not with my permission, nor was I aware of its presence in the notes before the volume was bound, J.E. Lyall. And so clearly, he knew that was controversial. And he was kind of stepping back from that conclusion.
It flew right in the face of Millbrook Development Company, which is the company you referred to earlier, and which was made up of Mr. Thorne and Mr. Dietrich and people like that, which were the same estates around.
What's the name of the company?
Millbrook Development.
It's the realty company.
Realty company that divided up all the village and planned it.
Actually, you want to talk about the last part here?
Yep, we'll talk about the
We'll wrap it up.
We'll wrap it up. So, as a result of the Lyall report, they held 2 meetings. One was on March 8th and one was on March 9th. March 9th was the public meeting, right? Just to present it to the community, what they gained from this report, and probably what you gained from this report also, is that they wanted sewer, garbage collection, even if it was only 1 time a month, they would take that. They wanted better sidewalks and roads. There were no sidewalks in Millbrook back then, and the roads were in pretty terrible condition. They started the meeting with a hymn, a scripture, and a prayer. So, parks, this goes through parks, better agriculture, teaching through the public schools, better roads, better sidewalks, expanding the village, teaching good citizenship, investigating the crime, campaigning against the liquor, that was a big one, protecting against the dust and flies, which was also a huge problem. And we didn't talk about the milk supply, but that was a whole other section of the study that they did. Because as many of you know, Millbrook is known for its dairy farms. So again, they wanted the clean water. This is where I think this is the town hall, right? In the elementary school.
It's,
That's town hall or that's the old one?
That's the old, I think, yeah, where the town hall is, or it could be the old grammar school, no, John?
Yeah, could be.
I think the intermediate is grammar school,
Yeah. So you can see in that photo.
which was torn down when the Elm Drive School went up.
Right. I don't know if you can see back there, but that's where they got their water supply